Socialism is standardly defined as collective ownership of the means of production. Now, what does that imply for your sex life? Sometimes socialism is conceived more narrowly as an economic doctrine about the management of resources and the economy for the benefit of society as a whole. And this is contrasted to free market capitalism, in which each individual manages his or her own resources for his or her own benefit. Yet when we talk to economists, they will tell us quite correctly that the most important economic resource is people. They speak of human capital and human resources. And that means that a phrase like, quote, collective ownership of the means of production, unquote, has some very broad, very deep, very important implications. If human beings are the most important means of production, and socialism means collective ownership of the means of production, then socialism means collective ownership of human beings. And if human beings are produced by sexual reproduction, and socialism is about state management of production, then socialism means state management of sex. Now, that's not just a cheap shot theory jab or rhetorical wordplay. It's the actual theory and the actual practice of leading socialist theoreticians and activists for the last 2 centuries. And that's what this podcast is about. Now, control is the important theme, but I want to start with a nice American socialist, Robert Heilbronner. He's probably the most distinguished academic socialist of the 20th century. He was a professor at the New School for Social Research in New York, author of the multi-million copy best-selling Worldly Philosophers. And what I've got is from an invited article that was published in Dissent magazine, which is a leading socialist periodical. And I want to start with Robert Heilbronner because we will be soon turning to some more extreme socialists, but I don't want to give the impression that only extreme socialists advocate these views. There's a continuity of principles from kind of nice professorial socialists like Robert Heilbronner to the others we will get to shortly. So here's Professor Heilbronner from the article in Dissent magazine. Quote, "If socialism is to be a new socioeconomic formation, I must hammer home this premise. Then it must depend for its economic direction on some form of planning, and for its culture on some form of commitment to the idea of a morally conscious collectivity. These 2 elements seem to be, to me, the only alternatives to the anarchic character and alienated culture of welfare capitalism." As I've mentioned before, the footnotes and the sources and so on will be at the website when the podcast is published. Yet, by contrast, Heilbronner is noting capitalism's all about free markets. It means letting people do whatever they want with each other as long as it's voluntary. But we can't have that, Heilbronner argues, because that leads to lots of waste and chaos and bad things happening. We need planning and control of the collective. And this, Heilbronner insists, this is again from Dissent magazine, requires authoritarian power. Another quote. "An aspect of authoritarianism resides inextricably in all planning systems. A plan is meaningless if it is not carried out or if it can be ignored or defied at will. Some form of penalty must assure the necessary degree of compliance. Compliance need not be total, and penalties need not be draconian. Incentives may succeed where punishments fail, but planning will not assure a socialist society of a capacity to endure or adapt unless the planning is a system of effective command. From that conclusion, I see no escape." Unquote. Now, note the key words in this quotation directly from Heilbronner: authoritarianism, compliance, punishments, command. Further, Heilbronner writes, quote, "The factories and stores and farms and shops of a socialist socioeconomic formation must be coordinated if socialism is not to become even more anarchic than capitalism. And this coordination must entail obedience to a central plan." Unquote. Again, note the key words: centralized coordination, plan, obedience. And now we make the connection from this general economic theory and this old-style communalism to individualism about sex and love, which we want to contrast. Now, our theme is sex and love, socialist style, and socialists in the modern world are reacting against our modern and highly individualistic approach to sex and love. And it's worth mentioning how that individualistic approach itself arose out of a revolt against old-style communalism. In the olden days, you belonged to the family and or your feudal lord. Now let's think of Romeo and Juliet, which was written by William Shakespeare at the dawn of modernity. And it's absolutely a cultural datum point that we all know the story of Romeo and Juliet. We know its theme. It's from the late 1500s, but it's based on a theme that had become popular in the late 1400s in the Italian Renaissance, precisely when the fight for individualism was engaged. Now, in the story of Romeo and Juliet, Romeo loves Juliet, and Juliet loves Romeo. But that is not the most important thing, according to their parents. The important thing is that he is a Montague, and she is a Capulet. They are part of a larger social unit to which they owe their first allegiance. It's not individualism. They should marry and perhaps find love, but based on what's good for the social units to which they belong. Their own selfish personal love choices are of relative insignificance, and in this case, both sides are urging that they be sacrificed. And that's the conflict: individuality versus collectivity. And that's also the tragedy of the play. Romeo and Juliet were young. They were not able to withstand the social pressures. But we have mostly learned the lesson, precisely because Romeo and Juliet is such a popular play, and we have changed our moral attitudes. We, as modern individualists now, encourage people to choose for themselves. We think love and sex and marriage should be about happiness and not about doing your duty to family, doing your duty to society and larger communal units.
Join Professor Stephen Hicks on his Adventures in Postmodernism tour next March in Australia, where he'll be giving you his insights and lessons on the subject firsthand. Find out what makes postmodernism attractive. Why is it so dangerous? How has it evolved or mutated over the years? Does postmodernism have strong connections to neo-Marxism? What is the role of it in cultural wars, campus battles over free speech, political correctness, intellectual diversity, identity politics, and the rise of Antifa and alternative right? What other political movements are now adopting postmodernism strategies, and how do we resolve these issues of postmodernism? Stephen Hicks will be appearing in 4 major Australian cities throughout March 2019. He'll be doing an evening talk in Melbourne, Sydney, Adelaide and Brisbane starting at 7 p.m. and will be holding an all-day special event masterclass series starting at 9 a.m. on March 10th in Melbourne and March 16th in Sydney, where he will delve even deeper into understanding postmodernism, its history, and teach you valuable strategies to actually combat it. For full details and to reserve your tickets today, go to truearrowevents.com. Select the event to which you would like to attend, and if you hurry, you may even be lucky enough to get your tickets at early bird prices at a 50% discount. And while you're in line, please leave us a review for the podcast on iTunes or Stitcher. Now back to the podcast.
Now, in the later modern form, though, we do find newer forms of communalism emerging, and that communalism and the socialist ethos can come in some different forms. There are new-style communalists who will make the claim that we all belong to each other. And when we think about the implications for sex, we start talking about free love and joining a commune and having anarchism when it comes to sex. And maybe your immediate reaction to that is, woohoo, I can have sex with anybody I want. Yeah, but don't forget the flip side of this new style communalism, because the flip side is, yikes, I kind of belong to the community, and so I have to have sex with anybody who wants to have sex with me. But also, the new style communalisms are much more state-run, much more large-scale, and here the majority of influential socialist theorists and activists have had a lot to say about your sex life. Now here's Friedrich Engels. Engels is, of course, most famous for being Karl Marx's co-author of the Communist Manifesto. And here he is writing in 1881, a letter to Karl Kautsky. Quote, "There is, of course, the abstract possibility that the human population will become so numerous that its further increase will have to be checked. If it should become necessary for communist society to regulate the production of men, just as it will already have regulated the production of things, then it, and it alone, will be able to do this without difficulties." Unquote. And there we have it. Quote, "regulate the production of men," unquote. As with the production of things, by central control, state planning, and following the rules. Now let's fast forward a generation. The Marxist revolution comes to Russia. Lenin, Stalin, Trotsky's, and the other are turning Tsarist Russia into the Soviet Union. And here I want to turn to sex and reproduction policy in the Soviet Union, and the big name here is Alexandra Kollontai. Alexandra Kollontai joined Lenin's Bolshevik Party in 1950. And she was part of the Central Committee of the Bolsheviks that authorized the insurrection in October of 1917. She was a very early mover and shaker among the communists. Later, after the communists had solidified power, she became Soviet ambassador to various nations, including Norway, Mexico, and Sweden, and she was honored with appearing on a postage stamp that the Soviets then produced. Now, I've got some quotations here from Kollontai's Theses on Communist Morality in the Sphere of Marital Relations. You can find these quotations at the Marxist.org site. Actually, you can find the full article, the full manifesto there. These theses were published by Kollontai in 1921, shortly after the revolution and as the Marxist-Leninists were consolidating power in the Soviet Union. And in part, these are aspirational because in addition to the huge task of socializing the entire economy, Kollontai is arguing that we must socialize sex and family life. As a good communist theoretician, she's identifying her enemies. The enemies are individualism and capitalism. And especially in capitalist societies, individuals are encouraged to freely pursue their own values. Under free market capitalism, families are formed voluntarily, typically first by the choice of the man and the woman. They choose each other, they decide to get married, and then they are organizing their mini social unit to satisfy their self-interested needs and wants. As individuals, they want love, they want pleasure, they want companionship, they want mutual economic and psychological support, and so on. But all of that is bad, Alexandra Kollontai declares, because, quote, "the family teaches and instills egoism, thus weakening the ties of the collective," unquote. And in direct contrast, Kollontai goes on to argue, quote, "the communist economy does away with the family," unquote. And this is a direct consequence of its general principles. Under communism, economic organization is collective, including the creation and development of human capital. Quote, "responsibility for the care of children and their physical and spiritual education is assumed by the social collective," unquote. Now, what about women in particular? Kollontai herself is a woman, and she points out that, while men do have a role in this whole economic production of human capital thing, women really are the primary producers of human capital. So Kollontai then notes that women therefore are especially to be collectivized. After a woman has given birth to a child, quote, she no longer belongs to herself. She is serving the collective, producing from her own flesh and blood a new unit of social labor, unquote. Isn't that a lovely phrase? Your child is a new social unit of labor, unquote. And accordingly, under the dictatorship of the proletariat, quote, the law ought to emphasize the interest of the workers' collective in maternity, unquote, thereby regulating the woman's reproductive habits, from the quantity of her sexual intercourse to the quality of her sexual intercourse, to her relationship to the biological father, to how she behaves while she's an expectant or a nursing mother, and to the education of the children she produces. All should be under state control in the interests of the collective. No privacy, no individuality, no choice. Now note that Kollontai mentions both the quantity and the quality of a woman's sexuality. It's not simply the numbers of children that she produces, the numbers of social units of labor that she produces, right? But rather how good or bad her resulting production is. And this, of course, raises the issue of eugenics. And Kollontai does subscribe to some tenets of eugenics. To protect the collective interest, for example, quote, those with illnesses, etc., that might be inherited should not have children, unquote. Now, it's a very good question why the far left abandoned eugenics after World War II, but let's save that for another time and look at another group of socialists in the 20th century who took the collectivization of sex and ran far with it. And here I'm thinking about the National Socialists and their theoretician, Dr. Franz Hamburger.
In Stephen Hicks's book, Explaining Postmodernism, Skepticism and Socialism from Rousseau to Foucault, he writes an incredibly crafted and well-argued insight into what postmodernism is, why it exists, and why it is dangerous applied in the wrong dose, in the wrong place, as it frequently is in this day and age. Postmodernism has been the most vigorous intellectual movement of the late 20th century. In his book, Hicks traces the roots of postmodernism all the way back to the Enlightenment era, where he systematically charts how the age of reason sowed the seeds of unreason that was to follow, making a clear connection between postmodernism to history, leftist politics, and even the ugliness of contemporary art. Hicks presents his thesis with beautiful, easy-to-understand explanations that burn with logic and common sense. So if you've ever wondered why society holds so many assumptions about the world, and you want to understand the chaos of what is happening, Hicks's work in this book provides a huge piece to this puzzle. Why do skeptical and relativistic arguments have such power in the contemporary intellectual world? Why do they have that power in the humanities but not in the sciences? Why is a significant portion of the political left the same left that traditionally promoted reason, science, equality for all, and optimism now switch to the themes of anti-reason, anti-science, double standards and cynicism? This book is by far the most helpful resource I've ever come across for understanding why the world is turning into a direction that I just can't comprehend. Pick up your copy of Stephen Hicks's book, Explaining Postmodernism, Skepticism and Socialism from Rousseau to Foucault, available now on Amazon.com. While you're online, make sure to subscribe to the Open College podcast, hosted by Stephen Hicks himself, and please leave a review for it on iTunes or Stitcher. Now back to the podcast.
Now, Dr. Franz Hamburger was a medical doctor trained in Germany and in Austria, and he rose to positions of prominence at universities, becoming a full professor. And he was a National Socialist. He joined the party in 1934. Now, what I have here is some excerpts from a major address that Dr. Hamburger gave to the German medical profession under the title, quote, National Socialism and Medicine, unquote, published in 1939. Now, the general story about the Nazi embrace of sexual controls, experiments, and eugenics have often been told, so I'm going to just limit myself to a couple of points about Dr. Hamburger's recommendations. And the point will be that none of what he said was controversial, given the nationalist and socialist collectivization principles in prominence in Germany at the time. Now, one point is that while the Marxists, the Bolsheviks, Alexander Kollontai, and the others were officially atheist, the Nazis were nominally Christian. An endorsement of generic Christianity is in the original National Socialist Party program, 1920. And in his address, Hamburger makes explicit to the importance of religion to National Socialist medicine. Quote, "We scientists and doctors simply and soberly affirm the principle of the strength of faith and the National Socialist principle of positive Christianity," unquote. And further, quote, "We doctors must never forget the fact that the soul rules the body. Soul forces are the most important. The spirit builds the body," unquote. So this is not a materialistic, physicalist approach. It's meant to be a pro-religion, pro-spiritualistic understanding of the proper place of sexuality and family. Yet I don't think the issue of religion is the most relevant factor here, because what really unites the communists and the Nazis is their collectivism, their demand for altruism, their demand for socialism in practice, or to put it negatively, their anti-individualism, their anti-egoism, and their anti-liberalism. Now, here's a quotation, a longish one, again from Dr. Hamburger, on the altruistic duty to have large families. Now, in part, given the militarism of National Socialism, the expectation of war, and that the war is probably going to last for a long time, there's an expectation that there's going to be lots of death, and those dead are going to need to be replaced. So we're going to need more good Germans and Austrians and others. So as part of the German war economy's long-term planning, Dr. Hamburger is arguing that the state needs to make sure that lots and lots of babies are produced. So here's the quotation, quote, "It has been estimated that every couple should have 4 children if the nation's population is to be maintained. But we meet already the facile and complacent expression of young married people. Quote, now we have our 4 children already, and so have fulfilled our obligations. What superficiality! Today we must demand a much higher moral attitude from the wife than previously. Either earlier it was taken for granted that a woman would bear a child every 1 or 2 years. But today, in this time of the manifold amenities of life, at a time when women are not denied access to these joys, of course it's understandable that she is eager to participate in them. Add to this that the knowledge of birth control is general today. Despite all this, women must be encouraged to give birth during 20 years of married life to 8 or 10 or even more children, and to renounce the above-mentioned joys of life. She must decide as a mother of children, to lead a life full of sacrifices, devotion, and unselfishness. It is only when these ethical demands are fulfilled by a large number of worthy wives of good stock that the future of the German nation will be assured." Unquote. So let's pull out the key words in that passage. According to Hamburger's philosophy of sex, reproduction is a duty. Note the word obligations. And it's duties to the collective, right? Note the nation's population is to be maintained. And it must be performed altruistically. The many phrases like renounce, sacrifice, unselfishness. The Nazis were able to draw upon a philosophical history in which those italicized concepts, those emphasized concepts of renunciation, sacrifice, obligation, the collective good, were of great cultural power. Nothing that Hamburger said was especially controversial in 1930s Germany. The individualism, the freedom were back burner issues. Now, that's an example from one major socialist experiment in the Soviet Union, another socialist experiment in Germany. I want to note some other fellow travelers in the West and further east. Here's an example of a Western Marxist, Wilhelm Reich. It is from an article from the 1930s, quote, "politicizing the sexual problems of youth," unquote. He was an Austrian, had been trained again as a medical doctor, but he was influenced deeply both by Karl Marx and by Sigmund Freud. In the 1920s, he was positioning himself as a Bolshevik. He was an admiring follower of the Russian revolutionary Marxists, Lenin, Stalin, and Trotsky. But in his own professional work back in Austria and later in the United States, he saw himself as attempting to integrate Marxism with psychoanalysis. And here's one form of the integration. Here's a quotation from Reich, quote, "Sex life is not a private affair if it preoccupies you, and in the form in which it has existed hitherto, it interferes with the political struggle," unquote. Lenin was right, Reich argues. Just as we have to get past bourgeois prejudices about privacy of property and the privacy of religion, we have to reject the privacy of sex. We each belong to the collective, and the revolution must thoroughly uproot all individualistic and capitalistic prejudices about privacy, personal choice, and belonging to oneself. And I'll make, of course, a quick mention here in passing of Communist China's one-child policy. It's the exact same socialist principles coming from the exact same sources, but it's conjoined with their, that is to say, the Chinese communists' view that they have too many people. So the policy then, for the good of the collective, is that government control is necessary over people's reproductive lives. Now, in conclusion, what we have seen is that the two major versions of socialism that dominated its 20th century history, the nationalist version in Germany, the internationalist version in Russia and China, they both really mean it when they say they want collective control over the means of production. And here I'm urging a cautionary note to Western socialists, particularly the young ones who, in my experience, they have a hard time understanding the implications of their own theory, and in part that's because they do filter it through their liberal individualistic culture that they are raised in. What they typically do is they pick and choose some elements of socialism that they like. Ooh, more free stuff for me, less inequality of money. But they under-investigate the full implications of phrases like, quote, collective ownership of the means of production. I often tell my students to read their intellectual opponents, and since most of them are broadly Democratic Republicans, that means telling them to read fascists and monarchists and communists. But in this case, I find myself telling socialists, especially the young ones, read your own theoreticians and activists, and beware. What you think you're signing up for is likely not going to be what you actually get.
The host of the Open College podcast, Dr. Stephen Hicks, is a renowned philosopher and author. His field of study and insights into postmodernism explain how it has become one of the most powerful intellectual movements of our time, and what that actually means. If you'd like to access more information from Dr. Hicks himself, then check out his website at www.stephenhicks.org. You'll be able to find details on his latest publications, courses, and philosophical information concerning business ethics, education, intellectual history, and religion. To stay up to date with the latest from Stephen Hicks himself, make sure you've subscribed to the Open College Podcast feed and follow at Open College Podcast on all your favourite social networks. And while you're online, please leave the show a review on iTunes and Stitcher.